Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today joined by a very special guest, Noah Tai. Noah, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, great to be on the podcast.
Noah, we initially met on Twitter when you had this sort of great series of threads on what we can call mental modeling. You call, what do you call it? Not exactly life hacks.
Yeah, something a little bit more than life hacks and a little bit less than sort of what would classically be called philosophy.
Yeah. I like that. So we'll get into that. But first, how do you sort of define yourself or explain to others what you're about, what your perhaps mission in life is, or what you like to spend a lot of your time thinking about and exploring?
There are a couple of perspectives on that. But first is this quote from Hermann Hesse's Glass-Speed Game that I love. He says, every one of us should be on our way towards perfection, should be striving to reach the center, not the periphery. And so I kind of want to be working on something that is common to any pursuit, whether you're coming at it from sort of software development or from like the arts or writing or anything. But more concretely, I do a lot of work in like software development tools. So I'm a programmer by trade, and I really am just really impatient about all the software that I imagine is going to be written in 100 years. And so I end up spending a lot of my time working on tools to accelerate that process.
What might that look like, or what more color can you give on that?
Yeah, it's super undefined, but like one is that we're the inheritors of this tradition of like nerds in the 70s spending a lot of time alone. And I think there's a lot of potential in making programming move from sort of a single player game to a multiplayer game, is I think what Patrick Collison describes it as. So it's like increasing collaboration is one of those. We just don't know how to collaborate on software, I think. And another is like understanding like what would it mean to visualize software, for instance? Like we have these giant text files, nobody knows what we know what they mean, but it's hard to like zoom out in the way that we know how to zoom out on a graph, right? We know how to zoom out on a map. We know how to like look at things from a broader perspective, but it's hard to really get a sense of what a computer program is like at a distance. So that's another thing that maybe we can make some progress on.
So we talked a little bit about on Twitter. We started talking about mental models. How did you sort of get interested in them in the first place? Because you've come up with some pretty original ones.
Paul Graham, in his essay on philosophy, he talks about how like philosophy is this pursuit, and it's where you end up when you just try to become more and more general. Like you're searching for like wisdom, you're searching for the most general kind of knowledge, and he says that actually ends up taking you away from something that's practical. And so I'm always looking for stuff that's like both practical but as general as possible. Because in my teenage years, I spent probably like 3 or 4 months reading the entire book of Proverbs in the Bible every day because it seemed to be like close to that sweet spot of having pretty general knowledge that's like still pretty useful, still pretty usefully applicable. But when I started working, I realized like there's a ton of stuff that isn't so concretely applicable that like you learned it in school or learned it in books, but also just like you have to learn it the hard way. And there were a lot of things in particular for me that I would, maybe because of my background, just like the kinds of things my parents would teach me, or because of like time that I invested in learning to program computers instead of sort of more general life things. I just started observing what worked and what didn't in my life, and trying to like change things and like observe in my coworkers and mentors what I really admired about them, and try to extract something from their experience in a way that I could actually apply it to myself.
Let's talk about advice. You've thought about advice from a few different angles. What advice do you have on advice?
Yeah, meta advice. When I was younger, and particularly right when I started working, I would I'd really treasure the opportunity to talk to people that I admired. And then I would just ask them oh man, what advice would you give to, to me, to a 20-year-old who just started working? And a bunch of them really wisely actually said, well, I don't really know you well enough to give you any advice. When we're looking for advice, what we want is the thing to do. We want some precise extent to which we should do something. How much time should I spend reading every day? Or how much time should I spend improving my skills rather than actually executing on them? We want to be a thermostat. There's some degree that we want to get to. But in fact, we as humans with human language, we don't have the ability to articulate this is the precise degree to which you should do something. All we can really say is you should do this a little more or a little less. What we can say is we're less like a thermostat and more like a bathtub. We can be okay, we're going to be a little hotter or a little colder. And because all advice can only be given in those relative terms, the only good advice can come from someone who really knows us. And this is actually Socrates' argument against books. So in the Phaedrus dialogue, Socrates says, books suck. The only thing that's really good is talking to teachers. And he makes the first argument he makes is that if we have books, people will forget things. Their memory will be worse. And people like to kind of make fun of this argument the same way you make fun of the people who say you can't look up anything on Google. So it's easy to make fun of that argument. But he makes this other argument that's actually really good. He says, look, a book doesn't know who you are. A book doesn't know what you need or what knowledge you already have. He says only a teacher who knows you can do that. Adler, in How to Read a Book, fantastic book, gives you the strategy for reading, where he says, look, you need to figure out what you're going to get from a book and actually pursue that. You need to be actively reading a book and figuring out what you know that the book is what you already know that the book is trying to teach you, as well as what you don't know, and try to seek out the knowledge that the book can give you. Because we can only give advice in relative terms, but because people also really believe the advice that they give, people tend to end up crystallizing in their mind the advice that they themselves need and saying, oh, everybody should learn to code, or everybody should read, or everybody should study the liberal arts, or whatever. They give you this relative advice and they cast it as absolute. They say, everybody should do this. So I guess the caveat that I would give before we move on to any other topic is just anything I say is probably only useful to someone who's more or less like me, who's kind of maybe has similar attitude or background as me and maybe is thinking about these things and just hasn't, if we gave them a couple more years, I'm sure they would get to it. But if I can kind of light the way ahead, not by a mile, but a couple feet, then maybe that's good.
I'm inspired by this idea you have of you're trying to find what's both practical and also general as possible. It does seem that there's sort of a wave of mental model sharing. It's all the rage. People are having books about mental model. It seems that that's sort of a concept that has been around for a long time, but is really taking off or becoming mainstream, or we're sort of on maybe the cutting edge of really exploring, understand, I guess. And part of that is sort of increasing understanding of, hey, we're not wired for certain things that make us happy or that make us wealthy, or that, even help. We're not wired to live the way that we currently live. And so how do we sort of trick ourselves in some way, or how do we sort of change the lens by which we view things so that we adjust better? Does that resonate with you, or how do you sort of think about that?
Yeah, there's one way to think about mental models, which is very much look, we have these biases, and if we instead cast things in these mental models, then that's a way to overcome these biases, right? So that's the scientific method is one, of course, extremely successful and popular model that's all about sort of overcoming your intuitive expectations about the world. Another way I think about mental models, though, is as kind of vague understanding. So this actually gets to, this actually touches on the scientific method, but I think if you're very clear about your mental models and you make an effort to fit everything that you encounter into your mental models, then you become much more aware, encounter some new piece of information or some new phenomenon that actually doesn't fit in. And if you're more aware of those, then you can actually sort of iterate faster on your thinking. You can, if you're immediately aware that you've encountered something that doesn't fit your current thinking, you can very quickly say, oh, that's a thing that I need to change my thinking on. I need to figure out how to understand this new thing that I currently evidently don't understand. So I almost like thinking about mental models as like an opportunity to show how my thinking is flawed and how it can be improved. But then another way to think about mental models for me is just like almost like an abstraction, like the way if you're writing code, you write the same line of code or the same couple lines of code a dozen times, you say, you know what, I'm not going to think about this anymore. I'm just always going to do it this way. And then you write it into a function. Similarly, like there are some things where if I have to keep thinking about them, it's going to be exhausting. And it's worth just sort of caching that and always doing it the same way. So those are sort of three ways to think about mental models that are somewhat in tension.
What do you think about this idea of, there's this quote, I can't remember who said it, but we have, Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, and that there are different ways for us to better adjust to surrounding. One is to, upgrade our emotions genetically via some futuristic, CRISPR-like technology. The other is to change our institutions. Like that's what Nudge was trying to do, I think, in some sense, like choice architecture, or change the incentives. And then there's, I guess, mental models is sort of its own version of that, or it's changed society so that it fits better to our wiring, what we're wired to do. Like, for example, let's say jealousy is an emotion. We're like wired to be jealous. Do we trick ourselves to be less jealous? Do we change our institutions so that, we have just as much money as the other people? Or do we hide it somehow? Or do we give in to this wiring? Or do we try to change it or hide it via institutions? What do you think about that construct?
I think there's, at a super high level, there are definitely things that we want to sort of change and overcome, such as, I think jealousy is a good example. And I think that sort of path leads to this very sort of rational way of thinking that's, more or less sort of the Western tradition. But at the same time, I think there's other times where it's actually important to not give in to your emotions per se, but like let your intuition guide you, because sort of the systematic analytical thinking is insufficient. And it's more necessary. And because those things are insufficient, it's necessary to kind of make judgment calls. Like one way to think about this is the distinction between sort of the judiciary and the legislature in government, right? Like the legislature is like, well, we're going to make these laws and make these rules and procedures and systems that are codified. But then when you get to the judiciary, while they abide by those rules, there's also a ton of judgment that's reserved for the judiciary, because the entire point is it's an acknowledgement that those systems are insufficient. That being said, I think it's somewhat difficult to talk about, for me at least, it's somewhat difficult to talk about developing intuition. When it comes to mental models for dealing with those biases, I think you phrased it as sort of like tricking yourself into thinking differently. And I'm reminded of this Morihei Ueshiba, the inventor of Aikido, the Japanese martial art, said. He said, the teacher can't actually teach you the techniques. He can only put you in an environment where you can learn it for yourself. And I kind of think the same way for the mental models, particularly the ones we've talked about, or we're going to talk about rather. They're less like a key that will immediately change your mind, and more like an environment in which, like, once you think within these models, they will sort of guide your thinking towards maybe being less jealous or being more thinking more rationally about whatever problem is at hand.
How do you sort of make sense of like, what's your best sort of explanation for what emotions are, what purpose they serve, and what to do with them? I think another way of framing that would be like, or one potential response could be something like, hey, emotions are sort of, feedback loops or signals that something is awry, and sometimes we should listen to them, and sometimes we shouldn't because they were wired for a time where we only lived in groups of 20 people, or reproducing was the most important thing, and that's what it's trying to tell us, and we should develop some sort of fluency around when these are correlated with things that don't serve us, and when they are. How would you sort of respond to that, and what's your take?
Basically agree to both of those at the same time. I basically think that emotions are the ultimate output of this huge information processing system that is our subconscious. And I think it's basically bad to ignore them. But also there are times when the right thing to do is to heed them, and then decide like, yes, I hear this emotion, but I'm not going to sort of give into it right now. And for myself, a lot of that comes from journaling. So I journal more or less every day, ideally in the evening, but I realized I was much more consistent about it when I gave myself the leeway to also journal about my day the following morning. Write out whatever is occupying my mind and giving me these emotions, and I try to tease apart, what events led to these emotions, and maybe what do these emotions mean? Am I feeling happy about something because I'm doing good work and it's something I'm proud of? Or am I feeling happy about something because I succeeded where somebody else failed, and I'm feeling this sort of more base emotion? The way I deal with it is I use my reflection through journaling as like a kind of check on those emotions. But the emotions there are emotions that give me a tremendous amount of motivation and productivity, mostly around sort of the joy of creation, the joy of connecting with other humans, and sort of feeling proud and good about helping other people and sort of contributing to society. So I think if one can be really aware about what their emotions are telling them, and how their emotions can be can bring them in directions that they want to go, then I think it's really worth sort of holding on to those emotions really tightly and letting them carry you along. Totally.
Let's talk about some of the specific, sort of models or not quite life hacks or philosophy.
Sure.
So what you have is look the other way. Can you talk about that?
Oh man, this one has served me so well. So there's this old essay from Paul Graham where he talks about programming languages, and he talks about how there are more and less powerful programming languages. And he points out that it's really hard to imagine more powerful programming languages, but it's really easy to look down at less powerful programming languages, kind of laugh at the people who would be trapped in such a less powerful programming language. So he points out that there's this attribute to this continuum where it's really easy to look one direction. That is, it's easy to look down on the less powerful languages, but it's really hard to look up and sort of imagine a more powerful programming language. And I realized there's actually a lot of sort of continuums that have that same property, where it's easy to look in one direction and hard to look the other. Most particularly sort of wealth and popularity and ability. Those are three areas where it's super, super easy to look up at somebody who's richer than you or more popular than you or more skilled than you. And well, really, I guess this is the one we were talking about a minute ago, really feel jealous of them. And that jealousy tends to make you unhappy. But if you can sort of force yourself to twist around and imagine the other direction and look the other way, you can realize oh wow, there's actually, I'm actually, probably most of us listening who are going to be listening to the podcast, I'm actually really wealthy. I'm comfortable. I have never had to deal with going to bed hungry. I have friends. I am pretty skilled. And in those three in particular, it's a really powerful tool for gratitude and sort of when you're feeling like when you're feeling insecure, like just sort of twisting it around and acknowledging like how much you actually have. But also there are times when looking the other way can be a really powerful tool for generating new ideas. So it's anytime you're criticizing existing systems, it's so easy to criticize whether it's the government or, some software you're using or even your friends. Trying to looking the other way in that direction can say, okay, I can spend a lot of time criticizing these things, but instead I'm going to try to think of like the positive version of like, if I were to develop on them, what would I develop? For me, a big one is looking positively on things that didn't turn out so well. It's anytime I find myself getting into a loop of self-criticism, I use this to like force myself to spend a little bit of time thinking about what actually went well, and kind of being more realistic.
How about the concept of an anticipation journal? And it's a contrasted in some sense with a gratitude journal. Talk a little bit about that.
So I think last year I was going through a bout of depression basically. And so I was searching for ways to like be more happy. And if you search the internet for this, what everyone says is you should have a gratitude journal. You should, write down 10 things that you're grateful for. So I was like, okay, great, I'll do this. I'd heard of gratitude journal before. I tried it and I found it trivially easy. Maybe because I had been sort of practicing my look the other way idea. I found it trivially easy to be grateful, and yet like it didn't make me more happy. And so then in sort of a meta application of looking the other way, I thought, well, what if instead of looking to the past for things I'm grateful for, what if I looked for the future for things that haven't occurred yet? This is somewhat embarrassing to say, but it took me 3 hours to come up with 10 things that I was looking forward to in the future, which is maybe a marker that something was quite wrong. But I think the usefulness of either a gratitude journal or an anticipation journal is just practice. You get good at what you do a lot of. And so if you just practice thinking of things that you're grateful for or things you're looking forward to, then you get better at it. And then, and you form a habit of, thinking positively either about the past or about the future.
It's funny. When I was growing up, I always used to, when I was a kid, I used to tell my mom, "Oh, I'm so excited for tomorrow. I'm so excited for tomorrow," or "so excited, for this upcoming thing." And my mom would say, "What about today? What about right now?" It's interesting.
There's that great bit in Star Wars where Yoda says, "You know what? I've been looking." I'm not going to use Yoda's syntax, but because I've been looking at Luke for a long time, and he is always looking toward the horizon, never toward the present where he is right now. And I do think, it is also necessary to be present.
It's interesting. I have this sort of potentially fringe view, which is I think we have sort of when we talk about the present, we sort of judge like the here and now, like there's sort of a tyranny of proximity a little bit. Like be present sort of means like there's someone else in the room, pay attention to them. But there's also like people on Twitter. Like there's a lot of life that's outside of the room right now. And why is that any less present? Does that mean then like the proximate?
Like proximity or like this is like the root of like saliency bias, right?
Yeah, or like how come when someone is on their phone talking to someone on Twitter or text, that is less they're being fully present with that person versus I feel like we have these biases towards like the real world basically. And maybe we should, or the real like the world in your immediate proximity. Do you have thoughts there?
Like there's one very good reason to be present, and that is that sort of the stuff that's proximate to you, by definition of being proximate to you, that's the stuff that you can affect the most. If you're alone in a room with someone, then you're the only person who can be talking in the room with them, and so I guess there's some sort of comparative advantage there.
Not if you're big on Twitter.
That's true. That's true. So I'm also a huge fan of the Long Now Foundation, which I don't know if you're familiar with, but basically their whole thing is to encourage longer-term thinking. So they're building this clock that's supposed to run for 10,000 years, and they hold seminars to try to encourage people to think longer term. I guess to some extent, I think it comes down to that slogan of like, think globally, act locally. And, if you are big on Twitter, or if you have some other faculty that allows your sort of present to be somehow bigger or wider in scope, then maybe that's like the right thing to do. There's a great bit in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations where he says, like, when you're going to want to do these big things, and you're like a little fire. Your passion is like a little fire, and you want to do these big things, like burn these big logs, but you like can't burn those big logs yet. If a little fire encounters a big log, it's going to be snuffed out by the log. What you have to do is like start with like a small fire, and then progressively burn bigger branches until one day you're like a big fire and you can burn that big log. And I guess when I talk to older friends who are more accomplished, and they end up in these positions where they're like on like a dozen advisory boards, like they'll swoop in and drop their nugget of wisdom and then swoop over to somewhere else. Like maybe when you get to that place, like being a little less present is the correct thing to do. And maybe when you're in your little fire stage of life and all you can do is, directly what you can do in the room or on your laptop or with the person you're talking to, maybe that's when being present is more important.
Talk a little bit about acting on curiosity and why it's important to aggressively do so, and what that looks like.
So curiosity is one. We talked about the role of emotions and how much to like pay attention to them versus like try to overcome them. Curiosity is one of the emotions that at least for myself, really, when I listen to it, really produces big benefits. Usually when I'm curious about something, that indicates that there's some that I've identified, that sort of subconsciously I've identified some gap in my knowledge that I would like to understand more. I've started just really aggressively, like if I'm curious about something, look it up, and if I can't, if I don't find answers quickly, like try to find a book that can satisfy me. And one of the outcomes of that is that like I end up starting a lot of books. So I have like a pile of 10 books on my bedside that I'm like quote unquote currently reading. I end up like in the morning or evening when I'm reading, I end up just picking up whichever one sort of speaks to me in that moment, whichever one maybe I've been thinking about that day. So like right now I have like Kierkegaard and Martin Gurry and something about finance and technology. And like at the end of the day, I might find that I'm really in the mood to learn about like how financing has impacted technology, or maybe I'm really in an introspective mood and I like want to read Kierkegaard. And I found that when I'm in the mood where I'm seeking knowledge for a certain thing, I'm much more able to digest that knowledge. I'm much more able to integrate it sort of with whatever else I'm thinking. So it's very much about like going with the flow of where my brain is at a particular moment in order to like maximize what I can get from a book. If you look online for advice about reading, a bunch of people, including Naval and Patrick Collison, talk about like just stop reading books that are boring to you. And they're totally right. I think for a lot of sort of nerds, maybe who've grown up playing video games, there's a desire to like finish the book before going on to the next one. But if you're reading a book that's boring to you, your mind's not going to be good at absorbing it. You're going to be less inclined to continue reading. In How to Read a Book, again, by Adler, he has this whole perspective that like books exist to serve you. You don't exist to serve books. Like there's nothing morally good about serving the book by like reading it to the end. But there is something good about reading the book that has what you need at this moment, so that you can learn from it.
No pressure to talk about this at all, and so when it's back to privacy as it relates to your own situation. But I'm curious if you learn anything or you have any insights of what you think causes depression for people. Like, what is depression?
I think depression is one of emotions that sort of are important to listen to. I think it is a sort of a signal that it's like the most acute way of your sort of intuitive subconscious system to tell you that like something is wrong with your life. I'm not like a psychologist or psychiatrist. I trust that there are some sort of purely chemical or maybe genetic causes of depression. I don't think they're what I was dealing with. I'm certain that there are many causes of depression, but the one that I think I'm most familiar with is I think closely related to burnout. There's this idea that burnout comes from just like working too hard or working too much. And I actually don't think that. I've put in like a lot of hours working really hard on some things. They did not lead to burnout. And the reason they didn't lead to burnout was because they had outcomes that I really liked, and I felt good about it. And I was proud that I'd worked on them, and I was pleased with my work. I think burnout comes when you keep working on something, you put a lot of time into work, and that work doesn't lead to any good outcomes, doesn't lead to like sort of what was expected. So I think if you're working on things that you're proud of and are going well, it probably usually doesn't lead to burnout. It's when you're working on something a ton and it's not going anywhere that it leads to what we would call burnout. And at least in my cases, when I was in rough spots in my life, depression was maybe like the next level on top of that, like the next level of burnout, maybe, where it was like, had these lofty goals or high expectations, worked on them really hard, and they didn't get anywhere. And I didn't really have like a plan for like what to do differently or how to get out of them.
Can you talk about shrinking the quantum of experience? I think this was one of the ideas I was most intrigued by.
Yeah. So this gets back to like how to read in the most effective way. So the quantum is like, the lowest measurable unit, right? I try to make the units of my experiences be as small as possible, so I get the highest resolution on things. So instead of reading a book, just read the Wikipedia article. Instead of eating like a whole cup of ice cream, eat like a spoonful of ice cream. And that has a bunch of like good effects. One is that you have less turnaround time. If you're curious about a thing, you don't have to hold it in your head and remember it until you get a book. You can just look it up on your phone immediately. And so that like reduces procrastination. But then the other effect is that once you had the like small quantum, once you've read the Wikipedia article or eaten your spoonful of ice cream, you can decide if you want more. You can decide that like, you know what, this is a thing that I really want to like dig deep and read not just one, but maybe 10 books about this. Or maybe you say, you know what, like I was really craving ice cream and that spoonful really hit the spot and I no longer require more. I had a roommate of mine who really understood sort of what my desires were for eating, and so my roommate would cook his dinner, and I would always be like really curious, like, oh man, my roommate comes from maybe like a different cultural background than me, like what is the stuff he's eating, and so I always ask him for like one spoonful of whatever he was eating, right? Like I didn't want him to be like cooking a meal for me. I was just curious, and he like really embraced that. I was like, yeah, here's your spoonful, and now I will eat the rest of it. And when I realized that he was cooking these meals, and I really only just wanted the novelty of trying it, I realized like I could apply that to not just knowledge, like looking things up, but also like experiences, like maybe, or like experiences in general, like maybe I want to go to a party, but I really only need to stick around for something as little as like 15 minutes. Or maybe I'm in the mood to like watch some like dumb action movie, but really all I need to do is like watch like the one fight scene in the middle. And so I think that the trap when you start thinking about doing big things, I certainly have this tendency to start making grand plans, like, oh, maybe I'm gonna take a whole like online course about this topic that I'm curious about. And really, like at that point, at the beginning, you don't really know how much you want. It's only by actually going ahead and experiencing it that you know whether you want more of that experience or not. So shrinking the quantum of experience both lets me satisfy those desires and interests more quickly, and also lets me really, really know whether I want to go deeper.
Yeah, the example that comes to mind for me is tasting ice cream instead of, or getting the sample instead of buying a whole one.
Yeah,
the sample typically solves it. It's a more elegant way of saying like lean, MVP things sooner, right?
Yeah. I think MVP is like the specific sort of entrepreneurial version of it, or product development version of it, rather.
When not shrinking, I guess, or like what's worth having the whole thing?
It's definitely possible to back out too early. So one is like some forms of learning. So really the general case for things that you shouldn't try to shrink your experience is things where you actually can't, where actually the experience itself is larger. It comes of a certain size and it's actually impossible to shrink it. One that I think of is that I have some friends who have had, shall we say, difficult dating lives. And when I talk to them, it sounds like really there's basically like a fear of commitment. And like, as far as I can tell, and this is mostly channeling stuff that my parents and older family members have told me, like a really good marriage basically takes an entire life. Like you can't experience what like a marriage would be like after like one date, right? And so there are some things that require patience and commitment. There's a lot of skills, like learning languages, that are just like very large tasks. And basically for these, I just rely on the sort of wisdom of others, other people who've learned languages or other people who've had great relationships and great marriages, other people who've built great products. I basically have to rely on them saying like, yeah, look, you got to push through this phase because you can't shrink it smaller than that.
How about the concept of recognizing genres of conversation?
Yeah, so this actually came about when I had a roommate who, it's like a Saturday morning or something, and he comes out with this startup idea, and he's like, "Oh, you guys have been thinking about this thing." I don't even remember what it was anymore. But the other roommate and I, we patiently listened to his idea, and then we like immediately tore into it. Like it won't work because of this. You'll never be able to get users because of that. People don't actually want this in the first place. It'll be hard to market. All whatever. Lots of criticism. And he basically, hung his head and walked away and felt bad about it. And we felt bad about making him feel bad. And when I'm reflecting on that, I realized in that moment, he wasn't looking for criticism. What he was looking for was for us to kind of share in his excitement and ask if there was something there. Rather, he wasn't asking if there was something there that could be criticized. He was asking if there was something there that we could get excited about, which it turns out actually there was. And I was able to go back and be excited about it with him. Once I had that model in my head, then I started realizing like, there's like a lot of other genres of conversation where people are really seeking a certain kind of interaction. A really common one is sort of commiseration, right? Like sometimes you just want to sulk about how bad something is together with somebody else who understands it. Sometimes people want encouragement or affirmation. So like as a somewhat antisocial nerd, like recognizing this actually made me much, much better at like being a good friend to the people around me. I could recognize like, right now this person is looking for this kind of conversation. Great. I can give them that. I can give them affirmation, or I can give them commiseration. I'm really inspired by, I think it's RSA encryption. I'm not sure. Like the three letters in the acronym come from I don't think it's RSA. Anyways, there was a group of three mathematicians who worked on public key encryption, and one of them actually didn't come up with any original ideas. The other two came up with all the ideas, and this third guy, he would just criticize all the ideas and tear them apart. And they worked in this very modal fashion where these two would go off, come up with new ideas, and then they would bring those new ideas. This third guy who then, if he could tear them apart, he would. And it was by working in that fashion that they eventually invented public key encryption. But like those two guys who were making new ideas wouldn't have been able to do so if criticism guy had been in the room with them while they were brainstorming. And so like hearing that story about how they worked really solidified to me the importance of like knowing what genre of conversation or working in general somebody's looking for and what somebody might really need in the moment.
What about, you alluded to it a little bit earlier, but talk more about modeling social needs like nutrition.
Yeah.
These are like paleo diets. Like how do we think about like different?
So I'll tell a story that gives some context. When I first moved to San Francisco, first started working, I thought, you know what, like I am just going to, like I'm in this new city and I don't have any friends here, but you know what? That's okay. I'm just going to spend all my time like working and learning and like improving myself and producing useful stuff. And so I spent 3 weeks with basically zero socializing. Like the only socializing I did was to like say hi to my coworkers and whatever sort of meetings at work. And that was like the first maybe week of that was pretty productive. But at the end of the third week, I felt this incredible loneliness. And it was like an acutely painful loneliness. Like I felt almost like being stabbed or something. Not that I've ever been stabbed, but like something incredibly unique that I never felt before. And then in that moment, I thought, well, it turns out I actually do have needs. I actually do have social needs, and I'm never going to let this happen again. I'm going to be very aware of what my social needs are. So I started actually trying to figure out what those needs were. In the same way that, like, if you started doing some weird diet, you might find that you had a craving for, like, if you went on like a vegan diet, you might find that you had a craving for not eggs, but you might have a craving for eggs, and you might deduce from that what you needed was protein, and so you might eat more nuts. And so I started realizing that, like, I basically need 2 or 3 times a week, I need to have like a close one-on-one conversation with a close friend, and like roughly once a week, I need some like more group setting, and like once every 2 months, I need some kind of like party-like environment where I'm like meeting new people and being exposed to like totally new and different people and ideas. It's like just recognizing that in general, I need different kinds of social interaction at varying frequencies. Lets me kind of plan around that in the same way that like you can plan your diet and eat healthy, and lets me really know that, like, oh yeah, this is, if I want to be happy, these are the kinds of social interactions that I can have.
You've thought a bit about being a contrarian and what that means. Why don't you talk about that?
Yeah. Contrarianism is an idea that's sort of bandied about around Silicon Valley. Peter Thiel, of course, famously embraces contrarianism. I had this interesting experience with contrarianism where I got together a bunch of my super contrarian friends. And I thought, I'm going to put all these super contrarian, super argumentative nerds in one room, and so I'm going to organize this contrarian dinner. I'm just going to see what happens. Like, is it going to explode in some like terrible argument? Like, what's going to happen? It turns out these like mostly techie contrarians mostly agree on most subjects. They're contrarian with like the rest of the world, but in fact, the way in which they're contrarian actually is pretty similar to one another. And so they ended up all agreeing. And it was actually one of their girlfriends who's like a punk artist who was like suspicious of power and money and such. She was actually the most contrarian person at the dinner. I think the right way to understand contrarianism is that it's high risk and high reward. So when Thiel is investing, it makes sense for him to be contrarian because actually, since he has like a portfolio, it's actually lower risk because he's diversified across the portfolio, and so he can still reap the high reward. It also makes sense if you're making a big bet and like there's like something you really believe in that you feel like you understand that the rest of the world doesn't. I guess that's like Peter Thiel's notion of secrets, right? But in other things, it doesn't make sense to be contrarian. It doesn't make sense to be contrarian about like minor things. Like it doesn't make sense to be contrarian about like how long your stride length is going to be, or what side of the street to walk on, or like what kind of water to drink. Unless, of course, you feel like you have a good reason for that, in which case you totally shouldn't contradict me. But I think some of the difficulty with contrarianism is that it's related to cynicism, in that it seduces smart people. Because when you're contrarianism, or when you're contrarian, or when you're cynical, you basically get to go around telling other people they're wrong all the time. And like if you're like a reasonably smart person, you can probably come up with decent arguments about why things are wrong. Like there exist counter arguments for most things, whether they're good or not. And so I think it's really satisfying to a lot of smart people to be contrarian or to be cynical, because they get to go around refuting everyone. But I don't think it's productive to be sort of unilaterally contrarian about everything. being contrarian for me has been a balancing force, to be sort of more of a, I really like being a generalist. And so whatever environment I'm in, I kind of I kind of have a tendency to take the opposite tack. So in school, I wanted to, I wanted to be focused on programming all the time. So I hated English class. But then when I got to Silicon Valley and I was coding all the time, and I was surrounded by other people who also had hated their English classes in school, suddenly I decided to start a book club. We're having these discussions that were basically, English literature discussions. And so contrarianism like that can be like a balancing force for myself.
For me, I sort of differentiate between, being a contrarian and being a troll sometimes, and see troll as being or just trying to get a rise out of people. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes I find I'm like, am I being a troll? Am I thinking that I'm being contrarian, but I'm actually sort of, I don't know, trying to get a rise out of people, or trying to shake things up? Or what is sort of the philosophy or motivations behind it? Like, why would one enjoy getting a rise out of someone, you think?
Oh man, I've thought about this a lot. I think there is a very pure, not pure in like a good way, but I think there is a very unalloyed pleasure that some people get sometimes from just being a troll and just getting a rise out of someone. It's kind of like, like a toddler who like knocks over a block tower just to show that he has some kind of agency over the world. I think there is a certain amount of trolling that is just not productive in any external sense, but just making people feel good about having some agency. For myself, I found that there's actually a third in between things. There's like contrarianism where it's like, look, I'm trying to take another position and I want to let you know that there's this other position. And then so it's like on one side, and on the other side, other extreme, there's like pure trolling just to get a rise out of someone. And then in the middle, sometimes I find that being a little bit of a troll, but when I reflect on it a little more deeply, I find that really what it is there's something contradiction, or there's something that's being swept under the rug or being glossed over, or being ignored. And I'm trying to call attention to that without really knowing the full sort of counter argument. I'm still working on figuring out what the right way to bring that up is. But I think it is useful to pay very close attention. Myself, at least, it's very useful to pay very close attention when I'm either being contrarian or kind of being a troll, and trying to tease out like, why is it that I'm doing this? Is there actually like a deep-seated concern that I have that maybe I can bring to light? Is there like an elephant in the room that I want to discuss, that maybe I can more directly discuss?
Yeah. Why don't you talk a little bit about epistemology? And it's something you think quite a bit about.
Yeah. When a lot of people are kids, they're sort of the traditional like monster under the bed. And that's like the fear that a lot of kids have, presumably. When a lot of people get older, a lot of people's fear turns to like existential fears, like does my life have any meaning or whatever. I've never felt existential fears in those ways. I do feel epistemological fears. I do get really concerned about like, what is knowable and what can I know, and to what degree am I certain about this knowledge? And a lot of this came from, I worked at Twitter for several years doing A/B tests, and so we were doing very practical, concrete, real world experiments and like learning from the experiments. And so I ended up, that led me to reading Karl Popper, who basically formalized the modern scientific method. So like in school, when you're taught about sort of like falsifiable hypotheses, and then doing experiments to try to falsify a hypothesis, that all comes from Karl Popper. And he lived like in the past century, like it's incredibly recent. Popper had this insight, and that he recognized an idea that a lot of people have. And he called this idea the doctrine of manifest truth. And the doctrine of manifest truth is the idea that if you see something that's true, you can recognize it for truth. You can recognize it for what it is. If think that's an intuitive thing. A lot of people think like, oh, if there was nothing sort of impeding the truth, if you could see things for what they were, then you'd easily be able to tell what's true and what's false. And so he points out that like the word discover, or the word discover comes from like discover, like you're uncovering whatever it is that's hiding the truth in order to make the truth plainly visible. And Popper points out that like a corollary to the doctrine of manifest truth is that if you are ignorant about something, that ignorance has to come from some evil force or some evil conspiracy that's trying to cover up the knowledge or hide the knowledge, keep it from you. But Popper's alternative idea is that attaining knowledge is really just hard. It's hard to actually know something with any kind of certainty. And that thought is what led him to sort of formalize the scientific method. You can, if listeners are interested, you can look up, I think Gwern has a good essay about how the knowledge that like lemons prevented scurvy was actually attained. The British Navy started supplying lemons on all ships, and so scurvy was basically no longer a problem. But because they actually used the word lime, and they didn't differentiate between what we would call lemons, yellow limes, that would actually had sufficient vitamin C, and what we would call limes, the green ones, that actually don't have sufficient vitamin C to prevent scurvy. They actually started supplying ships with the green limes, and then scurvy became a problem again. So it's actually the case that like knowledge is hard to find, and then once it's found, it's even easily lost. So trying to think about like what we can really know is maybe something of an obsession of mine. I had the privilege when I was a teenager of talking to this guy, David Baltimore, who discovered reverse transcriptase, which is kind of how AIDS work, or how HIV works. And he had this way of putting it. He said that the frontier of knowledge is near. You know, when you're in school, you read everything in textbooks, and of course textbooks only talk about what we already know. And so they bias you into thinking like, oh, there's all this stuff that we already know, and probably what we don't know is very small. But in fact, like what we don't know is far outweighs what we do know. And if you're willing to kind of strike out a little bit and do some experiments or try to do something new or unique, it actually doesn't take long to end up in sort of undiscovered territory, and where basically just humanity hasn't discovered it yet.
What do you think about the idea that the scientific method, while amazing for many things, many types of knowledge, is sort of incomprehensive or sometimes not necessarily destructive, but sometimes not helpful or actively unhelpful when thinking about sort of certain emotional or moral truths?
Yeah, so I actually totally agree with that. Popper himself, actually, he had an interview that he required to be published only posthumously, and in this interview, he admits to being he admits to being agnostic, and he kind of in that interview he kind of points out like, look, like we just don't know. So I think there's real limitations to what we can learn through science, and actually that was one of Popper's motivations was to solve what he called the problem of demarcation, which is like what is science and what isn't. So of course there's been plenty written about like how science relates to like morality or like or that kind of genre of truth. One of the other cases that Popper wrote about though is has this great essay called On the Status of Metaphysics, where he basically mentions like while science is good at growing knowledge and testing hypotheses, it actually just looking at data is not a sufficient source of new ideas for new hypotheses. You need something else to kind of power and generate those new ideas. You have some kind of creative juice. And he takes the example of Newton, who Newton posited like universal gravitation. His whole he's saying, look, it's not just like the Earth that pulls things forward. It's like actually every body in the universe like exerts gravity. And his contemporaries immediately like laughed at him and said, look, that's ridiculous. The stars are not pulling on us here on the Earth. You only think that, Mr. Crazy Man Newton, because you believe in astrology. Popper basically embraces that idea. He says, like, yeah, Newton was only able to conceive of universal gravitation and action at a distance because he also held the idea of astrology, in his head. A lot of people, when they think about Newton, think about him in terms of like, okay, he did like his cool stuff with like optics and like physics and calculus. And then on the side, he was also crazy and did this alchemy and astrology and this stuff. A common way of thinking about Newton is to think like, oh, he succeeded at physics in spite of his beliefs about astrology. But I actually think that he was only able to succeed in physics, not in spite of, but because of his beliefs in astrology and alchemy and whatnot. It's only because he had these other ideas kind of bubbling around in his brain that it enabled him to sort of break the mold and think of these new ideas. And so, touching on contrarianism again, like that's another way in which having these different ideas can really be useful. But ultimately, that's looking at that case study in Newton kind of shows us that like sort of just the scientific method on its own isn't enough to really power creativity and new ideas.
How about thinking about your mood and how you should sort of adjust to it, and then maybe you can get into sort of happiness generally.
So I think I, like a lot of sort of my peers, like to think of myself as this like disciplined machine, and like, oh, I'll like block out time and I'll do these things at certain times. And I think, many people can do that. But I've discovered the past year or so, actually at different times I'm in different moods wanting to do different things. And so in the mornings, for instance, I'm like much more sort of creative and free thinking. And in the afternoons are where I'm actually much better at sort of getting down to like grinding through maybe less expensive thoughts. So basically I realized that I observed by sort of shuffling the times at which I was working on different things. I observed that if like the first thing in the morning, I like spend some time reading and sort of reflecting on what I'm reading. And then after about an hour of that, then I sort of transition into a mood for where I'm good at doing creative work. And then when I get to the afternoon, I'm a little bit better at like more grindy work, like debugging or filling out lists of requirements or something. And just by observing those, I think it makes me both happier and more productive, which is like a win-win.
You had something here about observing your own revealed preference. So a question I sometimes ask is, hey, if I really wanted to be doing something, I would already be doing it.
Yeah.
That's an easy way to sort of convince yourself of like that, not to exercise or not doing hard things that you want to have done, but are hard to start.
Yeah. Revealed preference, I think, is a fickle thing. There are some times when it can actually lead you to realizations that align with sort of what you want to want. Right. So at some point I realized that like I had been eating ice cream in the afternoon every day, but then like one day, I don't even know why, but I ended up getting a cup of water instead. And I realized like, oh, after I got this cup of water, I actually don't want the ice cream anymore. And so by that totally random event, I realized that for ice cream was actually a desire for something cold and refreshing, and water did the trick. And as long as I was, counting nutrition and calories, I'd rather drink a glass of water than eat a cup of ice cream. So I think somebody on Twitter asked about real preference, and that's kind of, I think revealed preference is one of the things that many, but not all, sort of people around Silicon Valley are more aware of than sort of the general population. But it's got like the difference between the things that you end up doing versus the things that you kind of say that you want to do. And another way to think of that is kind of I phrased it a minute ago: the stuff that you want to do versus the stuff you want to do. right? Kind of like you pointed out, exercise. Like I want to, hit the gym every morning and then go on a 10-mile run and then, every day, like practice some foreign language for 2 hours or something. But if I actually try to do those, I become like pretty quickly pretty unhappy. And so it's there's a lot you can get out of doing things, and trying different things, and really paying attention to how satisfying they are. After you do them, do you still have a desire to do some other thing, or has that satisfied whatever desire you had? And it's an inverse of that is actually one revealed preference you can see is the stuff you procrastinate on. So I like hiking and I like backpacking, and I don't do it that much. And the reason I don't is because I actually really hate planning hiking trips, and I can observe that by noting that I keep procrastinating on it. I keep doing other things instead. So both by observing the things that are satisfying and by observing the things you procrastinate on and keep putting off, you can figure out what like really makes you happy in the moment, and distinguish between the things that you actually want versus the things that you merely think you want. One thing I note is that like among my friends who are like really academically successful, like straight A's all through college and grad school, that sort of thing, they seem to be really good at ignoring the emotions around their activities and really good at like doing what they're expected to do, which is, obviously really useful. But also for me, recognizing the things that I actually want to do and then capitalizing on them and doing them yields a lot of happiness for me. And that's how I end up working on the things I work on and reading the things that I read. And I have a few friends who because they are so capable of sort of cutting off their personal inclinations for what they want and what they enjoy and such, they have a lot of trouble figuring out what they actually want. And sort of once they end up doing sort of making the default move in terms of like just climbing the career ladder or whatever, it seems quite difficult to overcome that and perceive what you actually want and what you actually enjoy doing. But for me, that's been tremendously rewarding and yielded a lot of happiness.
Yeah, makes sense. Let's talk about free speech a little bit.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts there?
So free speech is fascinating because, to me, it's fascinating because it's a thing that in school growing up in the American education system, it was almost like religiously like, yes, free speech is good. And in the wake of sort of the last several years of global populism and such, there are many people who say, and like fake news and whatever, and many people who start decrying freedom of speech and saying, freedom of speech is bad. And a lot of that comes from observing sort of trolls on Twitter and on the internet, making trouble for people. And the reason they're able to make trouble for people is that these online trolls evidently have a ton of time that they can spend arguing with people. The sort of classical liberal conception of free speech seems to come from an era where, it was, some small elite writing op-eds in the newspapers or passing around pamphlets or sending letters to the intellectuals in Europe and like arguing within a small group. But it seems like the nature of that has changed in this world where anybody can kind of, if you have like an online presence, anybody can argue with you at any time. So a lot of people frame the criticism of free speech as saying like, look, there are these people, they have some bad opinion that I disagree with. They're anti-vaxxers. And so the problem is that anti-vaxxers exist, and so they should not be allowed basically to speak this idea. And the classical liberal counterargument to that is to say like, no. Yeah, that idea might be bad, but if it's truly bad, you can argue with them. And then you can argue with them until the truth kind of wins the day. The difficulty is that there are people who have infinite time to argue, whereas like you and I do not have infinite time to argue. We're also like trying to, solve problems and get things done. And the people who are, and I think the people who have a lot of time to argue, by a corollary is that they don't have something else that they're trying to get done with their life, and so I think they probably tend to have bad ideas. I'm reminded of how we dealt with, how to a certain degree we dealt with spam at Twitter. If you try to sign up for Twitter today, it'll prompt you for a phone number instead of an email, and the reason for that is economic. It's basically free to make an email account, and it's not free to get a SIM card. And so economically, then it becomes much harder if you require everybody to have a SIM card. It's much harder for a spammer to try to sign up with 10,000 spam accounts. And so one way to dissuade such bad behavior is to make it more expensive. And the problem is that arguing bad ideas and sucking up people's time with it basically is free. And so maybe there's some way that we as a society can, in the future, make it, for instance, more expensive to argue with strangers online, so that people would only do it if it really mattered. But ultimately, that rests on sort of the value of your time, which, again, the people who have better ideas, their time is very valuable. People who have bad ideas, their time is maybe not so valuable. So it's really unclear how we're going to solve that.
Yeah, it's interesting. There does, when you think about the sort of free speech debates that are happening on campus today, or about certain people not being tolerant of certain ideas, it's interesting for what a solution might look like. I
have a friend who's pretty active on Twitter, Maria Chong, and she told me one time, so she's an Asian American woman who pretty vocally comments on things online, and so of course, she basically attracts a lot of trolls online, and she told me one time, sometimes I have the time and the emotional capacity to really hear them out. And so I'll take, a morning and just try to really respond to everything a troll says and try to figure out what's at the root of what they're saying, and really listen to them. And usually, it's kind of somebody's sad and angry and frustrated. And if you're really patient and listen to them, you can kind of untangle that. But it just takes so much time and emotional energy to do that I just can't do it all the time. And man, when I think about that, it just kills me. Maybe one day we'll be able to, have bots for good that do that kind of free therapy for strangers on the internet. In the meantime, it's this very difficult problem of time and attention for people.
Yeah, some people have recommended that if we had some version of micropayments where it costs X to leave a YouTube comment, that you just get rid of trolling entirely. Who's going to pay to troll?
Yeah, the SDF was this old Unix system where they would give anybody a shell account on their server, but it cost $1. You had to mail $1 in the mail to them, and that was basically an effective deterrent. So maybe, yeah.
Related to that idea, we sort of, it's easier to recognize problems than solutions. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
There's this thought that you should only complain about things if you have a solution in mind. And while I understand where that comes from, I think basically I'm not a carpenter. I can't build chairs, but I do know enough about a chair to know that it's rickety or somehow insufficient. And so I don't think we should just reject out of hand complaints. And in fact, it can be useful if we're sort of aggregating complaints to get a better idea of what are the actual problems. I think a common criticism of sort of the contemporary wave of populism, starting with Occupy Wall Street, and to a certain extent, the Tea Party was they didn't have a lot of demands. They didn't have good ideas for how things should be solved. So that caused a lot of people to kind of ignore them and say, well, if they don't have ideas for how to improve things, then I'm not really going to listen to them. But in fact, the problems they're experiencing were real problems, and ultimately ignoring those problems, I think, has culminated in such things as the election of Donald Trump and Brexit, and sort of unrest elsewhere in the world. So I think it's actually worth really paying attention to when people are saying they have a problem, but basically disregarding what they say they think is the solution. It's worth really understanding what things they're complaining about, and then if you're in a position where you think you can solve it, actually trying to think rigorously about the way in which you're going to solve it.
We were just talking about free speech. There's this quote that you've been intrigued by, basically saying that some people think American football emerged as an outlet for the first generation of American men who didn't fight in the war, and you wonder how much protesters in the last decade have been motivated by a similar desire to live up to their predecessors. Talk a little bit about
that. So basically, like there were several generations of young American men, starting with like the American Revolution and then like the War of 1812 and some other conflict I'm forgetting, but then ultimately the Civil War. There were several successive wars where like each generation of sort of elite American men had participated in the military. And then we get to the beginning of the 20th century, like the early 1900s. And suddenly like that has passed out of memory, and like there hasn't been a conflict for a while where young men could feel they'd like proven their manliness. And then around that same time, football emerges, and in the beginning, there's no forward passes. It's just like a bunch of guys line up and then run into each other. And if you read descriptions from the time, it seems like a very boring sport. But it was this way for Harvard students to say like, oh, we beat the Yale students or whatever. I kind of feel that so one explanation for the emergence of football was that it emerged to satisfy that desire. And I kind of feel like similarly, people in kind of my generation have grown up, hearing about the civil rights movement and suffrage and everything, universal suffrage. And while our society doesn't place the same value on military service as it used to, I think our society today does really glorify those protests and civil rights movements and sort of human rights in general. And in the same way that those young men before wanted to live up to that somehow and then maybe created football, and similarly, there are many young people today who want to be able to follow in that tradition of protest and want to be able to follow in that tradition of advocating and fighting for human rights. I had some peers in my high school when we were all going off to college. They were so excited to go to Berkeley, which they saw as this ground zero for civil liberties. But if you go to Berkeley today, it's not like a bunch of hippies who are protesting. It's a bunch of like really obedient students who like scored really highly on tests and are really good at doing what teachers tell them to do, and it doesn't have that sort of revolutionary feel as we imagine it did or it had. So it might be similar. It might be that a lot of I just realized now this is something of a contradiction in myself. To the extent that we might judge these protests as being kind of about nothing, maybe that is motivated by a similar desire to just live up to this tradition. But just a minute ago, I said that when people complain about things, they're probably identifying problems, even if they don't really have real solutions. So maybe I should iron out my inconsistency there and say like, they're protesting something, and we should really pay attention to what they're protesting, even if they don't even really know what is at the root of it.
Yeah, no, it's complicated. One thought that you've been sort of thinking about is that a lot of criticisms of society today, whether capitalism or office work, are actually trying to criticize industrialism and industrial culture. And maybe the idea of central planning. Talk a little bit about that.
There's this trend where it's like, I don't know if fashionable is the right word, but it's somewhat popular to criticize capitalism and say that capitalism has caused all these problems. Recently, I was reading this very strange small book called "Tools for Conviviality," and in this book, this guy actually criticizes not capitalism, but industrialism. And so one way to characterize industrialism is to say that industrialism is this belief that like some one like man with a plan can solve everything. If only everybody follows the plan, if they sort of subjugate themselves to the system. And so from this, you get like metrics and process and lack of individual freedom. And like anytime people complain about being like a cog in the machine, like some kind of dehumanization, it actually all kind of stems from this industrialist mindset. And that comes from the Industrial Revolution, and it comes from sort of the science in the modern era, where there was all this stuff that could be achieved if only 100 factory workers worked in this factory and did their job. But that has a bunch of not so good side effects, which I think are often the things that people are actually thinking about when they criticize capitalism. So anytime we're valuing some quantitative metric over like some qualitative human experience, whether that's sort of the mindless pursuit of money or like trying to increase the GDP, right? People. So one criticism of the current system is that like, oh, the GDP may be increasing, but like the experience of being like a random person in rural Arkansas or wherever is actually not very good. And you can blame that on capitalism, but I had come around to thinking that we should actually blame that on this industrial mode of thinking that's all about maximizing these metrics of output. Again, in Tools for Conviviality, he talks about how like the Soviet Union actually bought into the industrial mode of thinking. Like, yeah, they were like central planners and like communists, but and like America was capitalist, but ultimately America was competing in this like, we're going to produce more stuff and have a higher GDP. And the Soviet Union like bought into that and started playing that same game. What that leads to is this society where we're like maximizing these metrics, but like individuals like don't feel so good. So I started thinking like, what's the like antithesis of that? Like, what would be the most extreme opposite of industrialism? It's like if you had some system that could maximize individual freedom and individual creativity. This ties into what I was saying earlier about acting on your curiosity, right? Like an industrial mode of thought wants the individual to not act on their own creativity, but instead just like do what they're told. But if instead we maximize individual freedom, and if we work towards improving the individual qualitative experience rather than any kind of qualitative metrics. And it also leads to the being a generalist rather than a specialist, right? Like for the reason specialization exists is because there's some plan that everybody's supposed to follow. And in that plan, then you end up, that naturally leads to specialization because we have, okay, these guys over here, they're working on task X, and these guys over there are working on task Y. But we end up that ends up actually suppressing creativity because when you're working in, the person at the top who's making the plan, they have some kind of creativity. And when you as an individual work in the generalist mold, you can have some kind of creativity because you're in an advantage where you can actually see the entire end-to-end production and you can understand aspects of the problem and like how to improve it. But when you specialize, you end up being confined to a small problem area, which goes hand in hand with minimizing your own creativity and your own freedom. It seems to me that industrialism, comes from the Industrial Revolution and factories, and it seems likely that as we move into, quote unquote, the creative economy and more sort of digital tools and creative freedom, that we're going to end up with some kind of new philosophy. I don't know where that is. I don't know where it's going, but it seems worthwhile to think about and pay attention to.
How go deeper into how you think about this difference between like belief in systems and belief in individuals, and where that manifests and how we sort of design society around that.
Yeah. So I think the best example, the best illustration of belief in systems versus belief in individuals comes from the Avengers Civil War movie, where there's these two characters. There's Iron Man and Captain America, and they're arguing about they're arguing about whether the superheroes should be regulated. Basically, Iron Man thinks that they should enact some kind of regulation and some rules around how the superheroes can act. And Captain America says, like, look, at the end of the day, I just believe in people. Like, I believe in like people that I trust who are like good people. I actually think this is a kind of uncommon way to think about the divide between sort of the Democratic and Republican Party today. People who tend to vote Democrat tend to think more in terms of like, we're going to build some kind of system that works. People who tend to vote Republican tend to think like, oh, we just need like good people, right? So like an example of that is gun control. There's the idea that like, we're going to build a system that works, i.e. a system where guns are controlled, and then there'll be less violence. Whereas sort of the right-wing view is like, look, we just have to have, like, the right people have to have the guns and then we'll be fine. The systems style of thinking springs from, I think, has two roots. The first root is what Martin Gurry in Revolt of the Republic calls the high modernist style of government. That is the belief that the government can solve everything. So like, the government can build nukes, it can put a man on the moon. Therefore, also, surely the government has the power to improve the economy and make every American happy. Now, from where I'm sitting today, it seems unlikely that actually the government has the power to make every American happy. But that's kind of the attitude that is adopted by that style. This idea that the government can't do anything. The other route to a belief in systems, especially from the government, comes from kind of a behavioral economics view. That says like, look, people respond to incentives. And so if we set up a system with the right incentives, then they will have the right behaviors that we, I think the flaw in that thinking is that ultimately there are things that basically the government can't do. And so if we try to do that, if we try to build the government or society in a way that will be able to make everybody happy, maybe that's just impossible and we can't do it. But there's an alternative way of thinking, which comes from sort of which I'm most familiar with in the Chinese philosophical tradition. I'm sure other people have talked about it. But in particular, this Chinese philosopher, Zhuangzi, who's kind of a predecessor to Taoism. Zhuangzi and Confucius both say, like, look, if you as an individual are like morally good, then that moral goodness is actually contagious. And so if you can be like a good person, that will cause the people around you to also be good. You will influence them positively. And ultimately, they describe as like a sage is like a person who by the force of their own character can actually cause a whole nation to be like better. And that's kind of parallel, like in the Bible, Jesus says like, first take the plank out of your own eye before you try to help, before you try to remove the speck from the other guy's eye. So I think when we notice that we're engaging in this kind of belief in systems and that the systems are failing us, one natural response is like, oh, we need more systems. We need more rules. We need different rules or whatever. But I think an alternative way of thinking is to say like, you know what, a system is just not going to solve this problem. What we need instead is like individuals who can do good. And that is like a lot harder. I think a lot of the appeal of a belief in systems comes from the fact that it's like a scalable system. Like if we enact the right laws, we only have to enact them once, and then we'll have the right laws throughout the whole country or whatever, and then everybody will be happy. Whereas like the task of like making every individual like a better person is much more difficult. But I think for some problems, that's the only way to do it.
Two more remaining questions. One, can you talk about what, if anything, you have to add based on what you've learned from reading Revolt of the Public or Martin Gurry particularly?
Yeah. So he talks about basically some of the effects of social media. So I became interested in reading Revolt of the Public because he supplies one explanation, one theory for sort of the current wave of global populism. And he talks about it in terms of like information in the internet and everybody being able to talk on the internet and sort of argue on social media. But a big thing that he emphasizes is that many of these problems, or many of the feelings of populism and people wanting to protest and criticize the government, stem from a feeling of distance between individuals and sort of the elites. I think this is a topic that's pretty, I didn't recognize it in reading these novels, but it's pretty well illustrated in some of Neil Stephenson's novels, particularly 7 Years, and actually his new novel, Ball. But basically, what Gurry points out is that this sort of belief in systems leads to a style of government, the high modern style of government, where like there's somebody who's trying to enact these big plans to change the economy, improve the economy, and like make people happy or whatever. But the more big those plans are, the more they require sort of a technocratic elite who, because they're working at an expert level, tend to have this feeling of distance from sort of the public who doesn't understand all the rationale that's going into making these plans. And Gurry points out that like it's actually that feeling of distance that causes a lot of resentment in the public. And I think you can see this in two people who've really successfully overcome that distance are Donald Trump and Trump and AOC both do a really good job of connecting to their supporters over social media and really making them feel like the government is now being run by one of them. It's not some faceless, unrelatable person who's running the government, but somebody that they can really relate to. That observation about that feeling of distance causing the resentment is one of the big things that I took away from Gurry. And I think we can see in Trump and AOC sort of what the future of the relations between politicians and individuals and constituencies is going to look like.
Lastly, can you talk a little bit about your skepticism of timelessness and how that squares with your sort of desire to find things that are both practical but general?
So I have this desire to find things that are so good that they're timeless, whether that's in sort of my material possessions or in the ideas that I'm seeking, or in the friends that I'm seeking or whatever. I'll take an example, like a backpack. I really like having a good backpack. And so I have this inclination to find a backpack that is like perfect for all my needs and is timeless. I can buy it once and I'll have this backpack for the rest of my life. That idea is really appealing to me. But actually there's no such thing as a timeless bag, because actually my needs change over time. And in fact, my knowledge of what my needs are changes over time. So what I thought was the perfect backpack, a year ago when I bought it, may change. I may start, take up some new sport, or I might need a different bag to ride my bike around the city or something. And so instead of investing a lot of time and money in like getting the perfect timeless bag, it's better to be sort of adaptable to whatever the current needs are, to be both in touch with what the current needs are and also willing to change them, or willing to change your behaviors to meet those current needs. So I used the example of buying a backpack, but this is kind of the root of like the scientific method in terms of getting new hypotheses and refuting them when you get new data and having new experiments that falsify old hypotheses. But it's also a thing that I realized is just like important in all my life, whether it's the tools that I'm using, the business I have, the habits that I have, the ideas that I have. It's much more important to be willing to change in order to fit my current needs. And that leads to like a sort of incrementalism, basically. That desire for timelessness, I think, comes from both a belief that nothing ever changes and also a kind of arrogance that like you can know with certainty what you're going to need for the rest of eternity. It stems from having spent too much money on some backpacks that I don't use anymore, but ultimately leads to really pragmatic incrementalism in all my life and my habits and what I'm thinking as well.
Yeah. No, this has been awesome, and we're almost at 2 hours, which is great. The podcast. Is there any other idea you wanted to really make sure you got across?
I think one really important idea that comes from experience, that I could only have learned from experience, is about being nice, basically. I think I grew up as sort of like a internet nerd who really bought into this cultural archetype of like kind of like the asshole alpha nerd. This is kind of like how Mark Zuckerberg, the character of Mark Zuckerberg, is portrayed in the social media or the Social Network movie. You know, there are lots of stories about Steve Jobs being this like really mean guy to everybody around him. I started my first job when I started working at Twitter. I was surrounded by the smartest people I'd ever been around, who also were the nicest people I'd ever been around. That idea that like I could be like really smart and also be really nice was actually surprising to me. And not everybody has such an experience, but it was really important to me in developing myself as a person who wanted to be not just really smart, but also really nice. So I don't know if that's a thing that just listening to it can imbue that in people, but if there's anybody who thinks that in order to be brilliant, they have to be an asshole, if I can dissuade them from that idea, that's maybe the most important thing that I can say.
I dig it. For people who want to learn more about you or your work or some of these ideas, where might you point them to?
You should follow me on Twitter, at NoahLT. Maybe someday I'll crystallize more writing into a blog or something, but for now, my Twitter is the best way to find me.
Awesome. Noah, thank you so much for coming, and I'm excited for people to listen to this.
Thank you.
And it was great to chat. I look forward to continuing our conversations offline and online.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.